Hello and welcome to another episode of Whither the Looniversity, the podcast of the Peerless Review. I'm excited about my guest today. His name is Dave Porter. He is former professor of psychology at Berea College. He was provost there for a time. Now he considers himself a professor in exile after he was terminated by that university, and he currently has some updates to give us as it relates to his ongoing case against Berea. He's also been faculty at the Air Force Academy. He has dozens of publications. His most recent publication you can find at the Peerless Review, peerlessreview.org, and that publication is How Hostile Environment Perceptions Imperil Academic Freedom, the Effects of Identity and Beliefs on Perceptions and Judgments. Dave, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think we're going to get into lots of stuff, Title IX, military wokeness, accreditation, but I think it's best if we start with your story at Berea and how that relates to your recent publication at Peerless. But I guess first, let's rewind to maybe 2015, where the troubles began, thereabouts.
I guess we could rewind all the way to 1949, where I was born at Berea when my father was a student here. And he went on to graduate from Berea, get his degree in law, and then became an FBI agent and moved to, from Kentucky, we moved to Detroit, Baltimore, Monterey, and Los Angeles. In 1967, I went into the Air Force at the Air Force Academy. In 71, I graduated and became I got a master's degree from UCLA in industrial relations, then became a helicopter pilot, flew for 10 years or actually 7 years in Hawaii, and then went back to the Air Force Academy. The Air Force was very good to me. In addition to the Academy and UCLA, they sent me to Oxford to get my doctorate in experimental cognitive psychology. I returned to the Air Force Academy in 1986 and became involved not only in higher education at the Air Force Academy, but at a number of accrediting universities. I was one of a group of people who worked on developing Western Governors University and establishing how that process would work. In 2001, I graduated. I retired from the Air Force, came to Berea as the academic vice president and provost. I had a background with, as I said, accrediting agencies, and especially the American Association of Higher Education. I had worked with them a lot and done a lot of visits, with the virtues and advantages of doing classroom assessment and assessment in general and its role in accreditation. When I came to Berea, it had a declining graduation rate. For the last 5 or 6 years, it was down to about 45%. And it had a visit from the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, SACS, the accreditor, that had over 50 recommendations. And recommendations are more than recommendations. As you know, they're really criticisms. And primarily in the area of assessment. So my background in assessment made me attractive to the hierarchy and the powers that be. I came to Berea and served as academic vice president and provost for 4 years. The kind of leadership I observed at the college was certainly different from what I had experienced in the Air Force. And I can tell you some stories about those differences. The president and I had very similar terminal values in terms of what we wanted with higher education, but very different ways of going about achieving those goals. So after 4 years, by mutual agreement, I stepped down, returned to the classroom, and became a part of the Department of Psychology. And that department became incredibly successful in terms of setting high standards, attracting students, especially students across the spectrum of identities and capabilities. But all of them, we found, had the capacity and the potential to become exceptional students. We got to the point where about 3/4 of our students were entering graduate school within 3 years after graduating from Berea College. As you may be aware, Berea College only accepts students who are basically Pell Grant eligible, come from families that make less than about $45,000 a year. So a lot of the students at Berea are students who have not imagined, or certainly not assumed, that they were going to get a college education to begin with. But they work together extremely well. They're very appreciative and grateful for faculty who work with them and help them learn and develop the skills they need to achieve success. And I was really proud of the department and what we had accomplished. One of the things that really applied or really attracted students was doing real research. There are lots of people who argue about the issues of the day, but few people have actual evidence or data to support that. And in industrial organizational psychology is really applied psychology of how do we measure the things that matter, and how do we make sense of those measures. And some of the studies we had done earlier were in the role that grades play in student success later on. And what we found is the general studies program, the grades in those courses that were required general studies were often very predictive of who was going to graduate, and also how well they would do later in their GPA success. So we also identified some real anomalies in different departments, where some departments were giving over 50% A's and others were giving less than 20% A's, which made it very, very difficult to use these data in any kind of prediction. And it would be in the interest of the institution that students make decisions on what they were going to major in, not based on how easy it was to get, basically, their actual interest and where they had capability. So 2017, I became involved as an advisor to a Title IX complaint. And what I observed was just absolutely contrary to everything I knew about Title IX, about fairness, about interactional justice, about due process, and about the Constitution. And there were some, I guess what I observed was a case where the administration was more an advocate than an arbiter or seeking the truth or fairness. And I attempted to get the president to speak out in favor of academic freedom, and he deferred, telling me that times were fraught and he was going to wait and see what the faculty thought about it before he said anything. I also, at one point drafted what would be an open letter to the campus, outlining all the things that I saw that were unfair. And in fact, the essay was called Unfair.
We should probably pause for just a moment to remind listeners that this was about 2 years after a Dear Colleague letter from Barack Obama's Department of Justice that essentially mandated that colleges and universities expand their limitations in terms of what would even count as a Title IX violation. And so essentially, Title IX was weaponized to police speech, to chill debate on campus. I would argue that it was a purposeful attempt to do that. I guess some people who are more generous to the Obama administration would argue that that was an unfortunate side effect. But either way, what happened, I think, was your colleague was accused by various other professors of producing a hostile environment, right?
Yes, and actually he was accused of many things. It was the kind of the tactic of throw a plate of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. He was accused of discrimination in hiring, discrimination in promotion, retaliation, and creating a hostile environment with about a dozen counts of instances that included scoffing at white privilege as violations or creating hostile environment. The first three of those, all the discrimination charges and the retaliation were dropped, and the majority of the incidents were dropped. The college ignored the severe and pervasive requirement that was supposed to be in Title IX to show hostile environment, and ended up convicting him on the basis of 3 incidents that had occurred over a 6-year period, and none of them were, injurious or willful or intentional. And I thought, to promote integration and to achieve the goals of Title IX and to create environments that were open to inquiry and conversation and inviting and supportive and not abusive. This was going in exactly the wrong direction. These are things that we talk about in industrial organizational psychology. And as I talked with my class about the underlying issues and the forms of organizational justice and the differences in those, and the tension between education's absolute necessity of academic freedom and freedom to express your views and opinions to the learning process, and restrictions about creating hostile environments, especially when they're defined as anything that might upset or make other people feel bad. There was a real tension there between those two things. And the student enthusiasm for this was as great as any topic I've ever brought up in class. Basically, the students wanted to understand what their rights were. There were students who had been thrown out of class for rolling their eyes at some claim that an instructor made, and required to provide written and a verbal apology before they could come back into class. That's a clear violation of their rights, not just of academic freedom, but free speech. And so the students were very interested in finding out more. There are a whole lot of variables that are involved. To what extent does one's identity affect these things? What about their beliefs and the effect on when you perceive a situation? Which situations are going to be perceived as hostile environments? Do people agree on those? And do people, when people make judgments about academic freedom, what is the influence of the hostile environment perception? There are a lot of students who think, and a lot of actually citizens who think, there's a hate speech exception to the First Amendment. Obviously, there isn't, and especially when hate speech is extended to anything that's going to upset other people. So what we have is a failure to communicate and a lot of misperception. And rather than rant and rave about it, the class and I thought it would be a great idea to actually try and take some measures. And in a sense, this was qualitative research in that we didn't delimit or define the variables beforehand. We wanted to ask a lot of questions and in a lot of different ways and see what the relationships among them was, and also to learn how you might measure some of these things. My own work at Oxford University was creating a computer game and looking at the way people played it and providing evidence that what people claimed or said sometimes was contrary to what to how they behaved and how they played the game. You know, that they had espoused strategies and tactics that made sense to them verbally, but their actual performance was sometimes quite different. And when you interfered with people's ability to talk to themselves by giving them a verbal side task, on some tasks, you could actually get their performance to improve. So if you stop people saying silly things to themselves, they sometimes perform better than if you let them blather on. So this was the setup for doing this survey research. And we came up with a survey that had about 80 items on it. Of those, about 40 items were connected to 20 scenarios. And these were realistic situations that could have occurred. Some of them occurred at Berea College. Some of them had occurred over the last 20 years that I had been there. Some of them occurred at other institutions, and some of them, not quite half of them had occurred at this Title IX process that I had observed, where there were a number of things that were just flat out wrong that the administration had ignored or never addressed. And I think getting the input from the campus community of how they felt about things, whether the situations described were actual hostile environments or not, and whether or not they would be actions that were protected by academic freedom, were important questions. And to find out how identity and beliefs predicted those two outcomes, the real goal of doing the research.
So let me sum up here then. In an attempt to gauge where the students of Berea College actually were in terms of their valuation of academic freedom, and how that is in tension perhaps with hostile environments. You compiled a survey, administered this. Some of the survey questions depicted scenarios that were similar in character to ones that had actually occurred at that university and some others. And the goal here was to try to quantify just how much of a value academic freedom is to the student body, and also to predict whether their valuation of academic freedom was dependent on their identity categories or belief systems. Is that a good summary of what the plan was here?
Yeah, that was very good. And at your encouragement, I included the whole survey in the publication on
So
Peerless.
now that the results of the survey are now available at peerlessreview.org.
Right.
And it was at this point that you ran into trouble with your colleagues, right? And as I understand it, their complaints were two. And correct me if I'm wrong. One is that they were some of your colleagues were angry that some of these scenarios had been adapted from actual existing complaints at the college. The other criticism seemed to be that there was no IRB or internal review board approval, and so that you were using human subjects without permission. So is it right that those were generally the two lines of criticism that you encountered?
I think the initial criticism came from a social media posting from one of the original grievance in the Title IX, who said the survey had no academic purpose or meaning, that it was pure retaliation, and I had unfairly involved students in what was she claimed was a purely faculty matter, that these were things that students shouldn't be involved in, and they're it didn't have anything to do with IO psychology, which was patently untrue. But when a person gets on social media and claims that they've been attacked by an old white guy, they often find many people who are sympathetic. And Brett Stevens recently had an editorial in the New York Times where he talks about evil clowns and cowardly lions. And basically the evil clowns are the DEI cadre, who often are not well prepared, who flout the rules and create programs that are sometimes counterproductive. But the real damage is done by administrators who are cowardly lions, and rather than exercising leadership and integrity and standing for the principles that are in faculty manuals and in the Constitution and in due process and our understanding of due process, they kind of rush to get out in front of the mob and pretend that that's leadership. And this was a case where what started on social media became, I'd say upset on campus. There were people who were distressed by it. My own students were getting bumped and nudged and occasionally spit at crosswalks because of what was being said. So there was concern, and the administrative response was to immediately shut everything down and basically say the side with the claim on social media that the survey really had no academic purpose, that it was dangerous and that it needed to be taken down, that I needed to be removed from the classes, that I was banished from the campus because my mere presence was seen to be a danger to certain faculty and students, those who had lied about me primarily, and that we couldn't give out what we had promised for compensation, a drawing for people who had participated in the survey, and that I was prohibited from sharing or analyzing the data.
Well, I'm happy that Peerless Review can host and allow you to share that and analyze it. But the result here, ultimately, of this cancellation attempt was that it was successful, right? They ultimately terminated your employment.
Well, yes, this was 10 weeks later. I wanted an immediate trial, but apparently that couldn't be. In the interim, I had a lot of students who were very supportive, who knew what the truth was. There was a Save Dave campaign, and they were putting stickers, which students who were apprehended doing this were called before the administration and threatened with disenrollment and suspension for having done that. The students still in the Student Government Association nominated me for the Student Service Award, the annual Student Service Award, and the Student Senate approved it. One of the grievance spouses basically was also an advisor to the Student Government Association and sent out a number of emails, which have since been determined clearly to be defamatory, that making false claims that I had refused to send the survey to the IRB, and that I was racist and misogynist, and that I was, this was a personal vendetta, and that I was in the process of being fired and shouldn't receive the award. And this was basically read to the SGA representatives, and they withdrew and decided not to award, for the first time that I know of in the college's history, or since they'd been assigning the award, no award was given that year. So I had support, but in the 10 weeks that I was also prohibited from communicating in any way with any student at the college by the president's direction. So I was isolated from campus. I couldn't go on campus. I was taken out of my classes. I couldn't communicate with students. 10 weeks later, after a lot of things had been said and done, I met a faculty appeals counsel. I had asked for 2 days to present my case, and they told me I could only have 1 day because the prosecution only had 1 day, or was only going to take a day, rather than clear and convincing evidence that had been used at other times in dismissal cases. This evidentiary standard of a preponderance of the evidence, which means 50-50 plus a feather, was taken. The dean himself served as not only the grievant, but the prosecutor. And he was also the supervisor of every faculty witness and everybody who was on the appeals committee. So, he made a number of assertions that they simply accepted, and they recommended to the president that I be dismissed for, and the actual charge was that my personal conduct had interfered with my professional responsibility. And the personal conduct, they said, was a breach of confidentiality requirements. And the professional responsibility was to maintain confidentiality, which the president himself had said in an earlier letter that Title IX, especially after a case has been determined, has no confidentiality. The idea is that the people who are subject to punishment need to know where the boundaries are and what are the kinds of behaviors that can lead to sanctions. And so, there are no confidentiality requirements. The survey itself, is anybody who wants to go and look, has no names in it. And the mix of scenarios, unless you already know about a particular instance or have heard of it, you wouldn't be able to identify or distinguish the ones that happened recently or long ago or at Berea College or elsewhere. So I think this was a pretext for getting rid of somebody who was arguing and calling into question some of the actions of the administration.
It seems pretty clear that that's the case. And you used the term there, preponderance of evidence. That's an evidentiary standard that was introduced to Title IX by that Dear Colleague letter. And if any listeners are unfamiliar, essentially what that says is that the existence of an accusation means that a fault probably occurred, right? It's 50-50 plus a feather is what Dave said, but really, it's used in cases like car accidents and things like this, where they say, why would somebody be suing for repairs to their car if an accident hadn't happened? So it's a very, very low standard of evidence, which was instituted into Title IX complaint processes by the Obama DOJ. But you're suing Berea College, and give us some updates on what you're hoping to get from that if you manage to be victorious, and what the state of that is now.
Okay, after the president made the decision to dismiss me, I appealed to the Board of Trustees, who reviewed the case and basically came to or supported the president, although they did say that they didn't think the dean had handled it very well, and he ended up stepping down. Following my dismissal, I went to the equal employment, Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Louisville, and filed a complaint, and they looked over it and basically figured it was beyond their interest to investigate, and so they gave me permission to sue. And that's an essential step that has to be taken. You can't just sue on a complaint related to retaliation or anything in Title IX without their permission. And really, my suit was for violation of a contract. Anybody who works for a public university, as you do, has constitutional protections automatically. Those of us who work for private institutions don't have those protections automatically. However, when the college in the faculty manual and other publications promises academic freedom and promises all the constitutional rights that are shared equally by citizens of a free country, quote unquote, then they have an obligation to live up to those promises. And so what we're really suing for is violation of contract. We also sued the person who had sent those defamatory emails for defamation. And the fact that on the one hand prevented me from receiving an award that may or may not have had monetary value. That was up to the SGA. It certainly, I think, helped turn the campus in a direction in the 10-week hiatus that I was away from campus and suspended and couldn't communicate. It didn't help my cause and hurt that. So first we tried that in state court. The college hired an attorney, and the individual who we were suing for defamation had his own attorney. These were, the college attorney himself was from, I think, the largest legal organization or legal firm in the state. They hired the second largest legal firm to represent the college, and another lawyer. So they had their stable of lawyers. They moved it from state court to a federal court because we had mentioned Title IX and that this could be retaliation against me because of age, race, and gender. And then COVID hit, and we went through a long process of discovery, getting records and getting copies of things that they sort of complied with and sort of didn't. Part of this was doing depositions, and the lawyer who represented Bob Baffert, who, as some of you may recall, was the one that had the racehorse that was accused of doping. He deposed me for 30 hours across 6 days, trying to, basically get their side of the story. We also deposed about another 8 individuals. And I think by and large, people supported my perspective, my views. We discovered things that had been done by the administration that were contrary to the faculty manual. All of this came before a federal judge. One of the things that is standard is both sides argue for summary judgment, saying we don't need to have a trial. The outcome is clear, and the judge can just decide. And surprisingly, to me anyway, and to my lawyers as well, the judge made a decision in favor of the college that I wasn't going to get a trial, and that basically I didn't have a case. We filed, there's a Rule 59E that is filing for reconsideration where there are errors of law and errors of fact. We identified 8 pretty substantial errors of fact and errors of law, and filed the request for reconsideration. Of course, when this gets done, then the other side has 30 days to file a counter argument to that. And then we had a week or two to file a counter to their counter. And so where the case is right now, Judge Karen Caldwell in the 6th District Federal Court has all that before her, and will make a decision. And depending on that decision, we can appeal to the 6th Circuit of Federal Court. And there is a lot of there are a lot of cases that are somewhat relevant to this issue of academic freedom. The most recent one, and probably the one that is most helpful, is McAdams versus Marquette University, where Professor McAdams was basically charged with posting a criticism of a student teacher and being discharged for having posted that criticism on his website. And initially, the court had found that the Marquette University, which was a private college, basically was within its rights to dismiss him. However, that went before the Wisconsin, is Marquette, Wisconsin, I think? Yeah, the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And they found in favor of McAdams, and he was reinstated. So potentially, what I have to gain is reinstatement and maybe recovery of my good name as, as a professor and teacher. That would come with back pay. And I've been unemployed now since September of 2018. And, once you've been dismissed for cause and declared incompetent, it's really didn't make sense to me to try and find another job. I've been involved in the case. Many of my students have stuck around and been supportive. The publication that you have on Peerless Review is really the culmination of a lot of that work, but we've given presentations. The Canadian Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship has been very supportive. The Kentucky Academy of Science has been very supportive and allowed us to present material from the survey successfully. The Mid-America Undergraduate Psychology Research Conference, my students submitted a poster there and got many very positive reviews from that. So I've stayed active and tried to do the best I can to continue to fight the fight, because it's not just about me. It's about higher education. It's about academic freedom, not just for faculty at Berea College, but students as well, and at other private colleges and universities, to extend the notion that once an administration extends a promise of academic freedom, that should mean something. And, in this case, if this is the hill I'm going to die on, I'm comfortable with that, because I think the study that you've published reflects what I know and understand in my approach to doing science and doing research. And I think it's good work.
I think so too. Let's shift gears a little bit now. And I'm going to infer a few things. And if I get it wrong, let me know. But I was looking at your CV again recently. You are a veteran, highly experienced in a lot of different domains of the military. You have been in the past a Title IX advocate, You served as a race relations instructor for some of your time at the Air Force Base in Hawaii. When I read your CV, it looks to me like you are of the sort of traditional liberal baby boomer sect, right? Where you are committed to diversity as an ideal. You think that Title IX was a great thing. And it seems to me that the your situation to some degree is because people who were on your side, so to speak, ideologically, have begun to consume their own. And I guess what I'm saying is you don't strike me as a particularly dogmatic conservative. And frankly, just in the few conversations I've had with you, you kind of seem like an old hippie who was in the military for some time. So am I right about that? Like, what happened? Like, you thought that you liked Title IX, you're an advocate of it, and you ended up being smoked by the same people who for a long time were right where you were on this stuff, I think.
I I guess I'd have to plead guilty to that, to much of what you've said. And I was a classic liberal, a hippie, or a progressive in a location where that wasn't particularly advantageous. In the 80s and 90s, while most of higher education was rushing to the left, I can assure you the Air Force Academy was solidly in the red, on the conservative side. And the fact that my initiatives and my approach to education, I think, were things that were matters of concern to a lot of people at the academy. Sociology course, there are many cadets who believed that they had never met a gay person or had never met an atheist. And so as part of the sociology course, we would invite panels from Colorado College Bisexual, Gay, and Lesbian Alliance to come in and talk to cadets for the first time. And it was, quite an experience. I was also president of the local Unitarian church, Unitarian Universalist church. And we had connections to both atheists and even Wiccans. And so, and I know a couple of times we invited Wiccans in who came in and talked about modern witchcraft, and just kind of blew the minds of some of the cadets. But this is what sociology is about. The vice dean at one time called me in and asked me to bring the sociology book. He was very concerned because he had heard reports of the diversity that I was promoting. And he looked through the book and came to the chapter on deviance and said, well, at least you teach them that it's wrong. and gave me a pass and let me go with that. So, I have been very independent throughout my time. I was involved in, environmental causes and was on the program committee for the first, second, and third National Environmental Film Festival that we had in Colorado Springs. We also sponsored a showing of The Last Temptation of Christ when a collection of conservative religious organizations had threatened to boycott any theater that showed it. We showed it in the Unitarian Church for 2 weeks, and basically we didn't charge admission, but we filled the church every night for 2 weeks for 2 showings.
Oh, let me pause you here for a second, because I am a man of the right, and if I can imagine some of my listeners who share my political beliefs would say, "Listen to this guy. This stuff was in the military, 30 or 40 years ago. We got Wiccans and LGBT education at the Air Force Academy back in 1978." And I'm thinking too of my father, who is a veteran, who was also born your same year, 1949, who would be horrified at the wokeness that's on display in the military now. So again, it seems like this stuff that you've been involved with for the better part of 50 years has metastasized now, right? It's become so toxic that it can no longer accommodate the kind of open inquiry and viewpoint diversity that you still value, I think. So how do you account for that as somebody who has been associated with progressive causes throughout and things like this?
Yeah, and I think wokeness is a term that has different meanings to different individuals. And cancel culture is inherently pernicious, where we're going to punish somebody for what they've said or what they think or believe. I think that's dangerous. I think that's unconstitutional. I think it flies in the face of everything since Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1919 had his great dissent, that basically the Constitution, the theory of the Constitution, is we have a variety of viewpoints. Critical race theory in itself is very closely aligned with, I think, a sociological understanding that systems are important, and systems basically are created and sometimes reflect the biases and prejudices of the individuals who create them. And so they need to be measured. And understanding political and economic systems is important. And so I think, at least as I understand what General Milley and other military leaders have said, is banning outright teaching any perspective or any theory. Should we ban teaching about communism, for example? I think it would lead to an officer corps if the academies were to adopt kind of an exclusive and narrow education that would not be as capable as the one we're producing now.
Is the one that we're producing now capable? And of doing what? Because I never served in the military, and I'm going to make my dad mad here too. But it seems, as far as I can tell, I'm 44 years old. With the brief exception of like a 1-month war in 1991, I can't think of a single thing that the U.S. military has achieved in terms of the conventional scope of what they're supposed to do, which is defend the military interests of the United States. Afghanistan was a mess. Iraq was a mess. And now it seems like they're more concerned with CRT and flying the pride flag at U.S. embassies than they are with advancing any sort of American interests at home or abroad. I mean, what would your response to that be? And feel free to smack me down as my father would, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think the American military is by far the most capable in the world. And I think what's happening in Ukraine now with not only American military equipment, but the training that is being provided and the model of leadership, military leadership that the Ukrainians have is a clear testament to how effective the military can be. I think militarily in Iraq, we were very successful. I think politically it was disastrous. And I think in Afghanistan, similarly, the military was very successful. The politicians were not successful at all. We got embroiled in conflicts that we didn't fully understand or appreciate. And we ended up with, people in the military basically do the best they can with what they have and in the environment that they inherit. And given those constraints, I think the American military has performed admirably. And if you look at our NATO allies, I think there's a high level of respect and regard for American tactics and leadership and the approach that's taken. The notion that well-educated and empowered officer corps is going to be far more effective than the alternative, the kind of Soviet authoritarian autocratic model. It was General Schofield, who said, the discipline which makes soldiers of a free country reliable in battle is not to be gained by harsh or tyrannical means. Rather, it is on the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds that in other days and other climes will bear the fruits of victory. That basically the idea of competition, the idea of exercise, the idea of activities make us an incredibly potent military force. And I think the American military, despite the fact that my politics were somewhat different than yours and different from, I'd have to say, the majority of people in the military, when it came time to for the rubber to meet the road, to have the exercise, to accomplish what needed to be done. And I had the privilege of serving in the rescue and recovery service. So even in peacetime, we had great missions to go on that resulted in life-saving missions. We got the job done, and we got it done very effectively. For every American in the last 50 years who's died in combat, not in the last 50 years, I guess, well, since Vietnam, every American that's died in combat, we've lost 5 in training and exercises that have gone on. And the idea is you sweat in peace so you don't have to bleed in war. That basically the American military, because of its exercises and activities, its ability of a command structure that's flexible, that can adapt to changes and changing environments, and think critically about things and act and respond effectively, I think makes us a very potent force. And I think militarily, we're very good. I think the examples you cited were largely political failures more than they were military failures.
Well, I don't want to get too far afield. As a rebuttal, I would point to the declining physical fitness standards for the military as one indication that just on the pure level of physical ability, we've had a decline. But to move back towards the academic world, that I alluded to this at the beginning of our discussion. I'm curious what you think. So you were kind of caught up in the revolution of Title IX that happened around 2015. In your opinion, was your experience the purpose of those reforms to Title IX, or was it an unfortunate side effect? I guess what I'm asking is because my own sense is that cases like yours are exactly what that Dear Colleague letter was designed to produce, right? That was the point. And there's in the sphere of things, the larger point is to make everybody on American campuses who holds any kind of different viewpoint from essentially the progressive leftism to be afraid to speak it, right? I had my own Title IX case that dragged on for 6 months for me. I got in trouble because I said that LGBT people didn't face discrimination in every corner of the work world, which seems to me to be just a blatant, obvious truth, right? There's lines of work where that might be an asset. But the way that I was repaid for that was a really sort of Orwellian bureaucratic process that by a series of lucky chips falling, I was able to beat. But I would argue that these instances like your Title IX situation, your colleagues, and mine, these are precisely what that Dear Colleague letter was intended to produce, in order to chill the ideological atmosphere on American college campuses. What say you to that?
Horse hockey. I think respectfully that I think it's a glitch rather than a feature. I think there are people on the left that are well-intentioned, but sometimes uninformed or misinformed. And I think much of the Title IX and the Dear Colleague letter is a good example. The agenda, the strategy, the ultimate purpose was hijacked by some of these evil clowns. And by evil clowns, as Brett Stevens points out, they're people without a portfolio or without expertise who think that feeling strongly about something is as good as having skills, and so they put into place recommendations that could work, but they could only work if the people who were putting them into effect had a high degree of knowledge and understanding of the educational process and of administration, and a profound respect for due process and for fair play. Unfortunately, when the evil clowns are joined by the cowardly lions, and there's a reason there's not an academic administration version of Profiles in Courage. It wouldn't be a very thick volume. There's a lot of pressure on academic administrators to basically go along to get along. And they feel that they're under attack from students, or they're under attack from faculty. They try and placate board members who have different views, and they end up very rarely taking stands like the University of Chicago, the Calvin report, or the Standards for Academic Freedom, I think are superb. And it is disappointing that we don't have more administrators willing to sign up and support them, and to take actions based on principles and knowledge and understanding of situations, rather than kind of knee-jerk reactions. So I think there are lots of glitches, and one might argue that wise politicians would have foreseen these and been more circumspect in the language they put in, and recognized that something like promoting the preponderance of evidence is not, is likely to lead to more wrongful convictions as much as it is, increasing the number of appropriate convictions. So changing the standards, changing the rules, misrepresenting and misinformation. I know one of the more recent things that I found most distressing was guidance from, I guess, the Department of Education, that they weren't going to prosecute people who had made false statements associated with Title IX cases. Now that is absolutely absurd, I think, because many of the claims that were made in the Title IX case that I observed, I think were suggested and put in there by the Title IX administrator herself, and they were contrary to the evidence. Dishonesty is dishonesty, and whether you're left, right, or wherever you are, misinformation and dishonesty needs to be identified and needs to be corrected.
This is why I think that your evil clowns and cowardly lions, I think there's some truth in that account, but I also think that both of those titles gives too much credit to DEI staff. The staff of these offices are neither evil clowns nor cowardly lions. They're just shit-lib political activists, right? They're morons. They don't know what they're doing, right? What they know, they're kind of like a little doll that's wound up, right? That just sort of chases after these violations of political correctness, right? They
Or they
really have
make up
no
the
skill,
violation,
huh?
or they make up the violations if
Well,
they.
yeah, I mean that's what happened in my case. Like the student came to the office and they said to him, you know, like what you've described isn't actionable. That's not an actionable case. But if you wanted an actionable case, then you could say this and this and this and this. Why don't you go write another complaint and we'll talk next time?
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I would consider the evil clowns.
yeah, I just think that you know they're so blinded by well, their own ignorance, frankly. Like, you know, the whole social justice racket is just a mark of poor education, in my view. And if you look at the qualifications of the people staffing these DEI offices, they have no real expertise in anything. Most of them aren't even lawyers, right? So they don't even understand the law that they're claiming to defend.
Now,
Um,
one of the most positive outcomes, and I actually have never met the individual, but the college went out and hired a lawyer to run their diversity office. And from everything I've heard from students and other colleagues, she's just done an excellent job. So that was a big improvement as a consequence of the mess that was made of my case.
Well, I'm really happy that you continue to fight it. When is the decision that you are expecting from the district court? Do you know when that might come?
Well, first we have the federal judge Caldwell has to decide on the 59E, our request for reconsideration. And then once that comes down, it'll be our decision whether or not to take it to the sixth district panel to appeal.
So
And
when will Judge Caldwell's decision come, though?
when she's ready.
Okay. So
Federal judges have their own, nobody
so
tells federal
maybe
judges when they have to.
maybe next week, maybe this time next year. Who knows, right?
I suspect a month would
Okay.
be a reasonable time.
All right. Well, I hope you keep me updated and I hope that Judge Caldwell has the courage to see the facts in this case and give you a W here. Dave, thank you so much for joining us and for filling us in. And I invite everybody who is interested in this stuff to check out Dave's great study at peerlessreview.org. It's up there now. It's the top listed article. Dave, thanks again.
Well, thank you, Adam. I really appreciate you standing up for your beliefs, and actually criticism is, I think, the best evidence of a belief and an aspiration to reclaim universities and higher education. And we can move forward together. And I think one way to do that is to minimize or to eliminate the use of punishment. Cancel culture, I think, is really the enemy. And it's not so much people on the left or right, it's the extremists among us on either side that keep moderates from having the kind of conversations that build communities, that build colleges and universities, and get on with the business of educating ourselves and each other.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I hope that the revitalization happens. Thanks again.
Thank you, Adam.